Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
That looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Workers who move to a region for oil, gas, and mining jobs often live in what are called man camps, residential villages owned and operated by their employers that are often located near Native American reservations. Investigators from groups such as Amnesty International point to such camps as a major factor behind the increased risk of murder, rape, sex trafficking, and human trafficking experienced by Indigenous people. In this episode of Challenge 2.0, we visit with two Native American activists about this and the broader problem of murdered and missing Indigenous women, men, and children. So on this very important and difficult topic, we're very fortunate to have two very well-informed and active people that have been deeply involved in these issues. We have Jennifer Bereskin, who is on the Path to Understanding board, the same program and group that I serve on, and has been on this program before. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Pamela Seamonster, who is also very deeply involved in activism on this issue as well. So thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I'd like to roll back to the year 2012. It seems impossible that we're already well into the year 2024, but 2012, there was a rape and murder of a school teacher that focused national attention on the men working on oil fields in North Dakota in what's, I believe, called the Bakken Formation or Bakken oil fields. And they lived in things called man camps. Now, I know you're both familiar with this overall problem that's associated with man camps and man camps themselves. We might just begin with an overall definition. Could one of you explain and define exactly what a man camp is?
Pipelines hire not local people, and so they hire people. When they hire people from all over the country, men from all over the United States, and a lot of this is also in Canada. I want to say this. This term started in Canada. And so they come in and they take over 100 acres of places that are like FEMA trailers and type things and travel trailers and things, and it's all men who work the fields, the oil fields, and what the ugliness that comes with that is usually sex trafficking and drugs, and so that's at the very lowest level. That's what we're talking about.
What is the general concentration of people living in a man camp? And I suspect that varies with the facility, but how many people are typically living there?
Oh, gee, I think that depends. Yeah, like you said, it depends on the facility. It could be hundreds, it could be 1,000. Yeah, it could be thousands.
We referenced a murder that occurred, and such murders and assaults are not unusual in the vicinity of these man camps. What sort of feel do you have for the relative presence and proliferation of crime in these vicinities?
It's prolific and almost, I feel, unanswered crimes.
Any feel for that yourself, Jennifer?
Well, when I think about these man camps, you've got individuals who are coming in who don't have any roots or any ties to that community. And you have people who I don't know what the hiring standards are for these oil companies. I imagine any company that is willing to destroy our environment to make a profit is probably not going to have a high standard when it comes to who they hire. And so my assumption is that they're just going to hire however many bodies and whoever's willing to do the work, which means you don't know who is coming into your community. And when we're talking about, a lot of the times these pipelines are placed closer to the reservations or towards in ancestral lands that belong to tribal nations, sovereign nations. And while I had looked up that story you had mentioned about that teacher, who was, killed in a small town in Montana, I think about there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous women and men who have been impacted by these man camps, but you would never catch it on the news, or they would never see any justice, or maybe not even find their relative. And so when I think about these man camps and I think about the company, and I know they are just going to take whoever they can, and they're not going to have any accountability to the impact, much, whether it's the environment or that community in particular.
Well, I think case in point with what you were mentioning in terms of the standards for some of the people that come in, and obviously we know you can't generalize, but I think the one thing that really brought that out and makes it pertinent, at least in my sense, to our discussion, is the unusual aspect of that is that it received fairly wide attention in the media. And people pointed out that's because the school teacher was white. And as you've both already mentioned, and perhaps you can go into greater detail, the proportion of people that are assaulted and harmed in the vicinity of these man camps is much greater among the Indigenous people that are living in that area. Do you believe that's correct, that if it was an Indigenous victim, that there would not have been that much attention given to it?
Yeah, there would not. There would not have been that kind of attention. There never is. There never is. I think that something that we're failing to, maybe we're just kind of glossing, but those are placed there purposefully. Those kinds of things are placed there purposefully. The American Indian, or the Indigenous person of what's now the United States, it makes up about 2% of the population. And yet yearly, 65 and upwards of little over 70% for the men, on different statistics, are coming up missing and murdered every year. So if you have 2% of your population and they're missing and murdered every year at that rate, that's genocide. And that's a word that nobody wants to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about that, and that's the bones of what we're talking about right now.
You referred to trafficking, human and or sex trafficking, and also the influence of drugs. Perhaps elaborate for us a little bit, both of you, on what influence or what aspect of the problem those present.
Well, when you're thinking about, again, the oil companies are probably just hiring whoever. So we know that our communities are often targeted for these reasons, that people are not going to be held accountable by law enforcement. Now, if somebody who, if a non-native or if a white person was kidnapped or trafficked, like in that story with that woman Sherry from earlier, you saw the immediate response by the community. I'd even heard that they had so many volunteers that they had to turn people away. Over 1,000 people for a town that was only 500 large. And they had the federal government, they had the FBI, they had all the different police. So when I think about, they know that our people, that they are going to be able to get away with any kind of crime that they commit against us. And I think this really falls under the historical foundation of this country, of how this country was built. This country was built on killing us and taking away any of the resources or any of our land or water. And so when you think about, while laws and policies may have changed, as we're going into this century, really the laws and things for us have not changed. It's still that cultural norm of killing us is beneficial to them, because again, we are a ward of the government. We are the government's responsibility, And so yet we are not going to be, that is not going to come out in data, that's not going to come out in the media, because then the U.S. government and the Congress would have to be held accountable for war crimes, which they should be, because it's war crimes that has been occurring to our community.
And sovereignty doesn't mean equal resources, right? So this little town got all of those resources. I could name 10 women who are missing from the Oglala Sioux tribe. And they don't have those same resources. Those resources aren't coming. We have men and women, families coming out on horseback looking and just scanning land and looking and looking and looking. And in urban societies, urban Indian societies, there's so much other, nobody's noticed.
Right.
Nobody's noticed. Unless, of course, you're killed by police, and then you really have to raise big noise. You know, the Puyallup tribe has been instrumental in creating change for one of their missing, because those people have worked really hard to bring forth legislation that talks about police having training and all kinds of other things. Because normally, you know, an Indian was killed by police, and what they're going to hear about that person isn't going to be anything nice. The media is going to smear that person instead of saying an Indigenous person was killed by police.
Any perspectives on that, Jennifer?
Well, like she says, it's genocide, and in terms of, I think about the way this country was formed in terms of policies and law. A lot of this genocide just didn't happen. Like it was purposefully intended for us. So I've always believed that those of us as tribal nations who've signed peace treaties with the U.S. government, they have an obligation to us, and to ensure that we can be a sovereign person. But I also recognize that they're not trying to help us to ensure that we actually thrive in this Western society. And so when I think about the disparities and the many things that our people are experiencing now, these are things that have been happening since the beginning of the formation of this country. If you know, it was our land and our water and all that encased that Mother Earth is what has provided the resources and the profits that has been extracted by this country and other countries. But primarily it was this form of genocide against us, so that they could extract all the land or all the minerals or all of the things that you could capture. You know, I know Washington State, it was our fish, like our salmon. You know, now we hardly have any salmon because of over harvesting. And when I think about, if there's no more Indigenous people, if there's no more American Indians and Alaskan Natives, then will they have to be accountable to the treaties? So if we are no longer existing, if they have completely exterminated us, because that's what the original intention was to kill the Indian, save the man. That was to ensure that either we were to assimilate completely into this Western way of world, or to completely exterminate us as a person, as a human being, as somebody who has been here since time immemorial. And so when we're talking about missing and murdered, you know, there's so many other things when we're talking about failed systems, or how people are, you know, our government systems and our law enforcement, they're all failing to be accountable for their responsibility to ensure our safety and our health.
When we talk about genocide, we're talking about environmental, cultural, and human genocide. And it's this, this idea of, like, for example, let's just talk about in the last 80 years. Or let's go back. 2 80-year-old grandmas. So when Lewis and Clark were here, when they stole a canoe from the Chinook, they wrote in their journals that they could walk across the tributaries of the Columbia River on the back of the silver salmon and they weren't sinking. You certainly cannot do that today. When my father was a young man, there's a picture of my father, and you know, he was 5'4", 5'6". There was a picture of him with a salmon as tall as him.
Don't see those.
You don't see those.
No. Some people might say, well, the crime rate in the vicinity of man camps is just representative of that overall area. But there have been some interesting studies that show that the crime rates are very different in the immediate vicinity of the man camps versus other areas, same county. Is that your understanding as well?
That's what I understand as well, yeah. Because we have a concentration, even though there's a concentration of people, but they're pulling in people. They're delivering drugs, and so they're enticing people. They're pulling in people who are then maybe going a little not too far away, and are committing crimes. But that the larger community doesn't have that problem. But what does have that problem is the adjacent reservation. That's an attack. Those man camps are a direct attack on Indigenous people, I believe.
Any perspectives on that, Jennifer?
I agree with what Pamela is saying, because I think it's really easy to, when you think about who's got the money in that situation, and I'm sure, you know, oil companies have a lot more money than a lot of these communities. So it's, when you think about, it's easy to punish and blame those communities who have been dealing with those issues in their communities or the disparities and say, well, it was all their fault. It's really easy to push that blame and shame on that community while not acknowledging, well, this company's bringing in jobs and this company is going to help, you know, strengthen our economy and those types of things, but not really acknowledging that they're bringing in people who know that they are going to be in these communities where there's vulnerable populations, and that they will be able, and they know that there isn't an accountability when it comes to law enforcement or how because it's complicated when you're dealing with crimes on the reservation versus off the reservation, and whose jurisdiction is that, and who takes the lead on that, and so it's much easier to commit a crime and or to commit a crime against a person in these areas that, you know, they're not going to go into these upper middle class or wealthier communities and place these pipelines in there. They would never. I don't think I've ever seen a place or know of any place in America or in Canada where these pipelines have run through the
upper crust communities.
Well, in fact, there's documentation of that, not just with pipelines, but in terms of highways, factories, factory farms.
Yeah.
In 2019, Canada released, I believe it was like a 1,200-page document focusing in on the impact of man camps on local communities, the problems that they created. Have we seen any similar sort of report collated or collected or performed in the United States? Either by government agencies or by the oil companies, since they're the ones that are ostensibly having this impact?
Well, I would imagine, I've never heard of the oil companies producing any kind of information like that, and if it was, I would believe it would be as greenwashed as their energy. We know, our communities know that we're missing people. Our family, myself and my partner, have we have like 3 people who have been killed, and and every day we know about someone else that's missing, and it hugely affects our communities. It's absolutely real, and the sad thing is that it's nobody's talking about it. Not mainstream media.
One magazine article that was done a couple of years ago had the title, "Why Aren't Fossil Fuel Companies Held Accountable for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women?" What would be your response to that?
There's no profit in that. But if I'm thinking of the first thing that comes to my mind, and I can imagine that probably also correlates why there's not many studies, because I realize that Western academics, it's like nothing is true unless it's been case studied and proven, and rather than just getting the word from the community themselves. And I know when we're talking about information has been extracted from our communities for a long time. We've been studied and all these things, but I would really like to push to see an Indigenous researcher be able to bring forth a study and really to, we have Northwest Indian College has wonderful scholars, and I think you're not likely to have an outsider be able to come into our communities and have us be willing to trust you to give you this information. And I think it's extremely hard. But I think in terms of, the accountability, like I keep going back to the oil companies lack accountability and transparency.
They don't even pay taxes. They got windfall profits for as long as my life remembers, right? So why do they care? There's no reason to.
Well, and the states that we're looking at for many of these facilities are, in fact, very friendly would be one way to put it, in terms of attracting these industries and these camps and the extraction activity. Perhaps very different than what we might see in Washington or Oregon.
Right.
When there have been attempts to go ahead and protest, demonstrate against the environmental impacts of such facilities, such extraction industries, what has been the typical response? Do you have much success in speaking out? You're shaking your head, Pamela.
Well, we speak out a lot, but but does anybody listen? You have to really,
and are
it's
such
so
protests
well, that's like
suppressed?
Standing Rock. They suppressed that, just like they suppressed Wounded Knee. They didn't let the 1973 Wounded Knee. They weren't allowing press in there either, right? So anytime it has to do with our people, they get to create the narrative of what's going on and feed that to the public, and it's always suppressed.
I might ask you, for the benefit of viewers that aren't familiar with that, tell us a little bit about what transpired at Standing Rock.
Well, briefly, this pipeline was supposed to go through a predominantly white community, and it ended up, they protested it, right? No, they don't want to put that through here. We don't want that in with us. And so they moved it over several miles and then put it, under the Cannonball River and through Standing Rock, and it went in, and it went in. We protested, we argued, we fought, we brought up 1,000 reasons why you can't do that to our water. All pipelines leak. All pipelines leak, and yet you put it under the main source of water for a certain group of Lakota people. And so that was the protest, and they said, hey, come to us, stand with us, So a lot of people went.
And wasn't there some violent suppression of demonstrations?
Oh, there was always violence, but there was violence like we were talking about with mercenary police, with Morton County police, with all kinds of police. There was police violence. They were shooting water cannons on November 20th. They were letting dogs out and attack people. They were on September 3rd, every time you turned around, they were taking out people's drones.
Mm-hmm.
They were doing all kinds of stuff. They were using military tactics. They had these sirens going off. They were doing flyovers. They were dumping stuff out of helicopters. There was, they were attacking us.
And that broader perspective of we focused largely on man camps right now. And the issues that we're looking at there, but it's much broader than that. And the setting that you were talking about, in terms of legal structures, et cetera, demand a lot more attention. And we're going to discuss that. Obviously, we don't have time in this particular conversation, but you've both graciously agreed to continue this.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to do another episode, and we'll take up those very issues. So Pamela and Jennifer, thank you both very much.
Thank you for having us.
And we'll look forward to continuing this conversation in the next episode of Challenge 2.0. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll connect with us again next week. If you've enjoyed this program, found the conversations informative, interesting, and thought-provoking, and the visions of people from different backgrounds, faiths, or wisdom traditions inspiring, people who can disagree without being disagreeable and respect the essential human dignity of all, perhaps consider supporting our organization with a contribution. Your donation will not only support this program, but also the broader work of our nonprofit charitable organization, Paths to Understanding. Thank you.